skeptical. That's all.
I think that it was an unfortunate thing that happened, and I think that it definitely worked to the advantage of the opposition and to the American press, and I think that they've completely capitalized on it. I definitely do agree that perhaps there is the possibility that something more could have happened. As you mentioned, some of the pictures that came out were actually people that were kidnapped. And the fact that the Syrian Civil Defense was there, they are a quite well-known propaganda agency. People have admitted that they've been actors for them before. I'm certainly open to discussion on that, though I personally don't really lend myself to that kind of extreme position. I definitely think that the Syrians did launch a strike in Khan Sheikhun, that they hit a weapons depot, and just so happened to be in that weapons depot that there were chemical weapons. And I don't think that, as I mentioned before, I don't think that sarin was the primary chemical weapon used. I believe it was chlorine for the reasons that we mentioned before, where just the MO of chlorine, the fact that this was clearly something going on with the victim's respiratory system, and the fact that, as you mentioned, the doctors were handling these people with their bare hands. If it was sarin, you couldn't do that. I've heard reports, some people have said, that possibly it could be sarin gas that was smuggled from Iraq, that was in the hands of ISIS. And that certainly could be the case, that perhaps ISIS and the opposition are getting closer now that both of those groups, or I'm sorry, the umbrella of those groups together are both losing against the Syrian Arab Army on essentially every front. They have a common ideology. They have worked together before, especially prior to 2013, where ISIS was considered a part of the Syrian opposition before, and the fact that the CIA has frozen funds to the opposition, as you may have heard, Reuters reported it. So this is well within the mainstream. So I think that certainly could be the case, but I think it's more likely the case that it was chlorine, because as we all know that they've had access to this for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that adds to your particular theory, I'm not taking a fixed position at this stage. I still want to see a lot of the evidence, but Syria's Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal al-Miqdad actually stated recently on Mayadeen TV that a few weeks ago he had provided the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW as it's called, with information about toxic chemical substances into Syria from across the border in Turkey. Did you hear about that?
I did, yep.
Yeah, so if that's the case, then the question that a lot of these people who are outraged at the Syrian government should be asking is, what are these so-called revolutionaries doing with large amounts of toxic chemicals? What are their intentions?
Well,
and what would the consequences have been had they weaponized those chemicals against government-held towns?
I mean, they have before. They have these rudimentary hell cannons that they use to launch strikes with these simple chemical weapons that they have. They've done it many times. We've reported on that as well. I've seen reports before. I think Cy Hirsch actually mentioned this in one of his articles, that supplies of sarin gas were taken from Libya at the beginning of the war, smuggled through Turkey, and given to the opposition. I've seen all these different theories. I mean, it is admitted by the United Nations and essentially most human rights NGOs that the rebels are in possession of chemical weapons, and we know that ISIS is possession of sarin gas. I mean, that's not even disputed at this point, I don't think, by anybody. I think a real question is, why don't we talk about, when ISIS uses sarin gas? ISIS, I think that everyone in the international community, everybody from Saudi Arabia on paper, Iran, Russia, the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, everyone hates ISIS, at least on paper. In their public statements, they do at least. And if that's the case, why don't we condemn the use of chemical weapons by this entity, which is supposed to be hated by the world? But when the Assad government allegedly uses them, it's all over the headlines. The United Nations has a Security Council vote on this immediately, without a report, without any investigation.
Totally, yeah.
Andrew, are you with us?
Andrew, yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear Andrew.
You're breaking up a little bit.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? I can hear you guys, both of you.
All right, I can hear you.
I can see you too, guys.
All right, so
Hold on. There's planes that fly.
so let's talk about this cruise missile breaking headline that happened. The U.S. is alleged to have bombed the air base in Homs. Some 50 to 60 Tomahawk missiles hit the air base. Conflicting reports coming in right now. Some people are saying there's no casualties. Some are saying there has to be casualties. Some are saying 20, 30, maybe one here and there. We're hearing that the Russians are there, the Iranians, Hezbollah at the base. So, Andrew, what do you think?
Okay, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, fantastic. Well, I think it's a guide to all of the civil opposition that they can just start staging any chemical attack they want to now and say, oh, well, look, it came from that airbase over there. And soon enough, there'll be no air bases left. Because if Trump blows up air bases on account of them having planes that apparently carry chemical weapons, then again, all the moderate head shoppers have to do is say, well, look, we just lost an airbase, so we just got gas, and it came from that airbase. And soon enough, there'll be no air bases left. I mean, the really important question is to know where we need to confirm whether or not the Russians were actually warned or not.
Absolutely.
That's
I
critical.
saw that from RT, yeah. They said that they were warned. Some people are saying that they weren't. You know, definitely need to pay attention to that. Me and Jay as well, we were talking about that before, that that is one of the key issues here. You know, the United States and Russia, that is a key issue of whether this conflict will escalate as far as the U.S. possibly invading. Jay, you said that you do not believe that American imperialism is willing to stand up to Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah and Syria at the same time. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, the only reason I said that is simply based on US precedent. I mean, in the case of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States spent quite a few years drumming up the Islamophobic propaganda to justify that invasion. And they did that after a long history of imposing crippling sanctions, cowardly sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 children. And after ensuring that Iraq had absolutely no means of defending itself, and had no strategic deterrence as well, you know. And they did all of that, and they started plotting this from the 90s onwards, and it was only after that long process of ensuring that they could like walk in without too much of a resistance at all. I mean, obviously they faced an insurgency for many years, but the actual Iraqi state, the Iraqi army, capitulated within the period of a month or so. Is not is not a similar situation at all. You have a country that has lost tens of thousands of soldiers. I'm not sure exactly. Some people say 100,000, some people say more, but really it's difficult to know. I mean, maybe Laith would be able to offer better estimates. But nonetheless, Syria has also gained significant battlefield experience. They've got a population that, for the most part, supports the defense of the government. And the support of countries that Iraq simply did not have. Iraq didn't have Russian support. Iraq didn't have, obviously, they didn't have Iranian support either, right? I mean, Saddam and the Iranian government were enemies, right? And so when you have a situation like Iraq, where the complete country was completely isolated, it was open to attack. A country like Syria has strong friends, and the United States doesn't really know what they want to do. The propaganda that they were able to pull off prior to the invasion of Iraq, they simply in the case of Syria, because the population is largely confused. You've got a lot of people who are quite like conservative and Republican voting who are quite shocked and upset with Trump. I'm not surprised with Trump, but they are, you know, and these same people, Republican voters, red states, living in the red states back in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, were actually quite pro-war, you know. So the dynamics are totally different. I think the idea that I think what the United States is really trying to do is to force some concessions, right? Because when they do things like this, it makes it difficult for the Syrian government to launch offensives, because a major airstrip has been destroyed, so they can't support their soldiers on the ground. That's one thing. Secondly, it forces the Russians to constantly be on standby. And so all of the forces in Syria defending the government have to constantly be on the lookout, towards the Mediterranean, just to see what's happening, just to see if there's any missiles like coming their way, and that itself is a major, psychological, like form of warfare that's been launched at the Syrian people in general.
No, and they ironically, in 2006, the dossier essentially by William Roebuck that was released by WikiLeaks said that was a major part of their strategy in confronting Assad as a leader, is to constantly be like a omnipresent thorn in his side to exploit what they saw as a paranoid leader. And they believed that if they exploited that, they could use him against himself and force him to make mistakes.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
do you think that
But it also goes.
Go on.
As they for launch, like instigate provocations in the hopes that the Syrian government does something stupid.
Absolutely. So Andrew,
yeah, I think that's definitely part of it.
I just want to just back you up there. I think that's absolutely the case. And the Syrian government has always reacted rationally and with a calm head. And now they've just gone ahead and done something like this. And now maybe they are waiting for speed provocation. This is it's not just playing with the Assad government. This is brinksmanship with Russia as well.
Totally.
I want to go talk about what Jay talked about the dynamic of American politics now. And this is something before we went on the air, we talked about a little bit. And it has appeared to me, I'm an American and I've been a registered Democrat ever since I could vote. And I have to say, just looking at my own people in my own party and being involved in the local party as well as the national party and, seeing these people, it definitely appears to me that the liberals have become the new party of war, especially if you refer to the fact that Barack Obama placed some 3,500 troops right at Russia's doorstep. As soon as Trump took power, Rachel Maddow went live saying that if Trump took those troops away from the doorstep of Russia, that meant that he was a puppet to the Russian government, which is an absolutely absurd notion and something I think at times definitely like shared between the two parties at some level. The idea that we should glorify militarism, before it was the Democrats for some part of the 20th century, especially during World War II, and then it kind of was shared between. I mean, as you mentioned before, every American president is a staunch promoter of war, but we definitely saw this with the Bush administration with the unilateral invasion of Iraq, and then Obama came in and escalated wars, started probably more wars than any president that in recent memory, and people really didn't care about this. And now Trump came in and campaigned on, to be clear, he did say pretty much everything. He was on both sides of about every issue during the campaign, but a lot of people, a lot of his supporters saw that he wanted to be, withdrawn from these conflicts. He said that we need to focus on America. And, that was something that the liberals hit him on. They hit him on the fact that he wanted to, have relations with Russia. And personally, as a Democrat, I don't see why it should be bad that we have closer relations with the second leading nuclear power in the world. I mean, that should be, in the collective, well-being of humanity right there. I don't see why peace is a bad thing, but it seems that there's always has to be one faction of American politics that is pushing us as far as public opinion and as far as the dialogue. There has to be somebody pushing us towards war, and that is now the Democrats.
Yeah, totally. But oh, sorry, no, I was just lost my train of thought. Ah, that's right. I wanted to bring up the issue of Syria's disarmament, because that's another thing that's also in the media, because all these accusations came out saying that the Syrian government is using sarin, but it's like the media has completely forgotten that in August 2014, or even earlier actually, maybe a few months earlier, the Syrian government had completely, like, the Pentagon actually had declared that Syria's stockpiles had been completely destroyed. They said we have destroyed 581 tons of sarin, right? And that's according to the Pentagon. Now you have the United States basically saying, if they go by their own allegations, is completely incompetent. That's what they're saying.
No, I mean, John Kerry and the State Department publicly said exactly what you said in 2014. And now you have the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, just saying recently that she believes we need to take out the Syrian Air Force because they are launching these wanton attacks against civilians.
Yeah. Maybe, I mean, a part of the here is that like as like one stage in their ongoing offensive against Syria was to have Syria completely disarmed. I think the United States did actually manage something of a regime change in Syria, only in the limited sense that they were able to get Syria to give up those chemical weapons. I mean, as Mimi al-Laham has said in the past, I mean, chemical weapons are a poor man's nuclear bomb. Syria had Scud missiles as well. They had Scud-D missiles that have potential payloads of between 600 to 1 ton with sarin. I mean, I don't know how much sarin you'd need in a payload like that, but that can devastate cities. And those are the kind of weapons that Syria had pointed at Israel's nuclear reactors, at their military facilities and air bases and airports, right? And that was their basic checkmate against Israel. I mean, Israel has had the ultimate strategic deterrent in the form of nuclear weapons, which Syria didn't have and was very difficult for Syria to get. One other thing that I think is interesting, because I've been doing a little bit of research into Syria's history with sarin, is that Syria's nationally owned pharmaceutical industry played a critical role in being able to gather the materials needed for the government to be able to, have the inputs to make the precursors to the precursors of chemical weapons, right? Because they got this knowledge from a variety of, and so it's interesting when you notice that in Aleppo, one of the things that the Turkish-backed groups did in particular was to basically loot all of Syria's pharmaceutical factories. Syria used to be 93% self-sufficient. Now they're struggling because of the Western-backed sanctions that have been imposed on them, right? And so you do see, I think, a conscious attempt not just to disarm Syria, but to destroy Syria's own industrial capacity to be able to arm itself in the future.
Absolutely. We were talking to the MP from Aleppo a while ago, and he was actually in the press years ago talking about how the rebels had scrapped industrial facilities in Aleppo, sold the technology to Turkey, the raw materials and everything, and that is definitely one of the cases. That is definitely the case, and that's something that they're actually working towards right now, and especially looking at the end game after the war is over. How are they going to reindustrialize? How are they going to, how are they going to be able to defend themselves against foreign aggressors even post-war? And that's always been a challenge for Syria. Even when they maintain their sovereignty, there's not a direct war going on. There's always that constant pressure against them, and going back to that point we had before about exploiting the paranoia of the government. I think that's a cultural thing with the government that a lot of people don't understand in the West. Why does the Syrian government do the things that it does, and what they don't understand, and it's not even actually unique to the Syrian government as well. It's kind of shared as well with like North Korea, Cuba, and different governments. Why are they the way that they are? Well, it's because there's constant threat. How do you manage to keep your sovereignty when you have both internal and external threats facing you at all times? I mean, Syria has been plagued with Islamists ever since it started. I mean, when Hafez al-Assad wanted to revise the constitution to make sure that anybody can run for president, even if they're not a Muslim, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to overthrow the Syrian government. And this has been a problem in Syria forever. When Cuba, becomes more authoritarian, as many might say, well, this is in direct response to, the attacks
Yes, exactly.
that Cuba faces from terrorism, external, funded by the United States, taking dissidents in, arming them, training them to fight the Cuban military. And this again was back corroborated with what the Roebuck report said, the exact same strategy, to bring militants and dissidents on to Saudi television, for example, and to tell all these like exposés about the regime and what they're doing and how terrible they are, and to foster extremism and to make people, like especially rural Sunnis, people who, because of the liberalization of Syria's economy, there was this income gap that was forming, that naturally occurs with when a country adopts neoliberal policies, to blame this on Iran. I mean, it's kind of like the way that Trump, blamed immigrants for a lot of the economic problems in America, to create this ethnic strife, and using the Kurds especially as a weapon. So it's always a threat. I mean, and I definitely agree that there's definitely a psychological element there too, against the people. And that is really the MO of how the U.S. has been in the Middle East, is divide and conquer, divide ethnic and religious groups against one another. And Syria is an exceptional case of that because of the diversity of civil polity in Syria, and they're managing to stay together.
Yeah, totally. We're not live now, are we?
Yes.
Oh, we are.
Yes.
Right. Okay. No, sorry. I was just agreeing with a lot of what you said. I mean, yes, when people say, for example, Syria is authoritarian, I respond to them by saying this is a country that's been forced into a decades-long conflict with the Zionists next door. This is a country destabilized by the forces of sectarian reaction. This is a country that's encircled by hostile enemies, and for some reason you wonder why it's authoritarian. People in the West don't understand their privilege,
It's not even paranoia, I wouldn't even say, at the point that it becomes true. I mean, how many times did the United States try to assassinate Fidel Castro?
Yes,
and
exactly.
I think personally,
it's easy for people to take
he handled it quite gracefully, considering.
Oh, totally. When you have like the superpower trying to kill you, but like, people in Western countries simply don't realize their privilege. A lot of the reasons why they have their liberal, free, democratic rights, like freedom of the press and all the rest of it, part of it's because there was struggle in order to achieve it, but the other half is because they belong to the countries that have bullied and intimidated the rest of the world. They're not the ones at the receiving end of it. Countries like Syria are at the receiving end of it. And so when I hear like these facile judgments of Syrian society, that don't take into consideration that context, I like to remind people of that.
And it's not even, really unique, as you mentioned, we have this privilege in the West. It's not even unique to Middle Eastern governments. It's not, I don't think that we should be wed, as many are, to the Orientalist position that, it's only Middle Eastern people that become authoritarian or, restrict civil liberties in time of danger. I mean, we see that in America with the expansion of the NSA spying. That was a direct result of the 9/11 attack and the war on terror. So that's certainly happening in the West as well. And we've definitely had especially in America, a huge crackdown from the beginning on what we saw as internal dissidents, with the labor movement, the violent attack on the labor movement, especially the COINTELPRO program that went from the Eisenhower administration all the way to Nixon, that went from espionage, illegal espionage, to inciting gang violence, all the way to political assassination when the FBI assassinated Fred Hampton, Black Panther leader, who was trying to create a unity between the Black Panther Party and the American labor unions to create an intersectional movement, and they assassinated him. So this has been going on for a long time. And I think a lot of the hypocrisy, especially in the context of the Syrian war, you see a lot of historical comparisons of what Assad is doing to what Abraham Lincoln did in the American Civil War. They suspended habeas corpus. In fact, a Supreme Court justice wanted to go after Abraham Lincoln for suspending habeas corpus, and Abraham Lincoln arrested his brother without a free trial.
The irony is, the irony in all of this, I mean, you talked about the suspension of civil liberties in a time of civil strife or war or something like that. But the irony is that Syria is probably the only country in the world, actually, that got rid of its emergency, got rid of its secret courts in the middle of a war. Because remember, that was one of the main demands that was being made, right? They said the Syrian government, well, the demands of like the internal protesters, the protesters that wanted genuine democratic reform, one of the things they said was, we're sick of this security court. We fear that it's being used to arrest and detain people arbitrarily. The Syrian government had discussions about it, and eventually they got rid of those courts completely, but they did that in the middle of a war, you know? And I don't think any other country has actually done that. Side of the story that we don't hear, if we're constantly bombarded with the idea that the Syrian government is just pure evil, you know.
Well, how about this? When Assad had the elections during the war, many condemned him, and U.S. officials said, "Oh, this cannot be a free and fair election because this is going on in the middle of a war." Abraham Lincoln himself had an election during the war, and Abraham Lincoln said, "If we did not have this election, we would let the rebels, the Confederacy, win. We would let them win over our democracy and our union if we did not have this election." And Assad pretty much said the same thing. He was condemned. Abraham Lincoln is championed in history as one of the greatest American presidents to ever live, despite suspending civil liberties, suspending habeas corpus, arresting people arbitrarily, having military courts to try civilians, and the list goes on. So there's definitely this double standard that exists.
Totally. And especially with Syria, people still refer to Assad as a dictator. Now, I mean, we have to really start unpacking and deconstructing what the West means when they use that word dictator, because it's been used and misused so many different in so many different ways, right? Syria, according to the 1970s, ever since the 1970s constitution, I should say, they have a clause in their constitution which says that half the seats in parliament have to be made up of workers and peasants. Now, so whatever you think about the Ba'ath Party establishing its dictatorship over the executive by saying, therefore, that the president has to be a member of the Ba'ath Party who's nominated internally, and the population throughout this entire period were only given the choice of saying yes or no on the ballot box without being able to choose a separate candidate. All of that entire system of right, and the one-party state system that was established in that old 73 constitution, all of those things were reformed. I mean, Syria, according to its constitution now, is a multi-party democracy. However, there are some restrictions, and the major restriction is that political parties, religion are not allowed to contest elections. But that brings up another point. If the so-called Syrian opposition care about democracy, and if we accept that the Syrian opposition, quote unquote, the Syrian National Coalition, whatever they're calling themselves, to Turkey, if they're really concerned about democracy, and if that's their genuine demand, and if they want to run as a Muslim Brotherhood type or Islamic type party, why don't they make that demand at the negotiating table? Why don't they say to the Syrian government, well, all we want is a change in the constitutional clause barring us from contesting elections, right? The fact that they haven't ever pushed this particular demand just shows you what they think will happen when they go to the ballot box.
Absolutely. And many people that I've talked to are saying that that's a major reason why the constitution being discussed in Astana will not be accepted by the Syrian opposition, because it creates a division between state and religion. So that completely makes sense, because they know that their parties are Islamist, and they know that the current constitution is secular. People are happy with the secular constitution. They're happy with people being able to run for president that don't have to be Muslim. So that's definitely one of the points there I definitely agree with. Another thing that I was glancing through, and just how committed people are to what, there was a big, as far as I was interviewed about this, and people asked me about different parts of the Constitution. Something that I thought was interesting was a huge push towards liberalization of the economy in a more neoliberal fashion. And I think that that was offered perhaps for one of two reasons. One, because they knew that the Syrians would reject this because perhaps the Ba'ath Party or whoever, possibly the citizens, though I don't know how much isms matter to people in Syria, that they might be committed to socialism or at least to the model of economics that Hafez traditionally had in Syria, something that defended public ownership of institutions. I think that is perhaps one reason that they wanted both parties to mutually disagree on the constitution. I think probably the more likely scenario is that the Syrians and the Russians believe that if they give in to pragmatically into the demand, that Syria opened up its market, which I think is definitely one of the biggest reasons why the United States and other powers have an interest in Syria, because they have an independent monetary system and they are separated from the global capitalist system in many respects. That liberalizing the economy and allowing for private investors and private entry into the Syrian economy would perhaps stave off a lot of the conflict, especially external.
See, thank you so much, Brad, for bringing all of this up, because remember how I said earlier before that we tend to do a lot of reacting. We're not really in the business of putting forward positions and setting the agenda in terms of what's being discussed in the media, largely because we're a lot smaller than the Western conglomerates that determine what the media is. But the economic history of Syria is something that's very, very crucial to this. People don't realize that prior to the war in Syria, before 2011, let's say, Syria had a per capita GDP of only about $4,000 or something like that. But when it came to life expectancy, education, healthcare, the status of women, Syria was one of the best countries. A poor country that punched above health in terms of human development is one definite way you can define Syria. If you go to the journals and the universities of countries that are not Western, they tend to recognize this. So I remember reading an article from Economic and Political Weekly, an Indian publication, which was praising Syria's healthcare system. These are things that matter to people in poor countries, but don't really matter as much to people in Western countries.
Absolutely. And along with this line, talking about the economic history of Syria, if you read a lot of the technical literature, the reason why people might say in international relations, is they say, okay, well, Syria is not a democracy, therefore it's more inclined to be violent, because they cite what's called democratic peace theory. The problem with democratic peace theory is that democratic peace theory is limited in what it calls democracy, and it assumes that Western-style democracies, which, to be honest with you, even technical studiers of people who study democracy professionally, such as Robert Dahl from Yale, realize that America, for example, is what he calls a plutocracy. But as a study from Princeton showed, I think that's a euphemism. I definitely think that he understands that power falls in the hand of a few people, though coming short of saying exactly that. There was a study in Princeton done that said that essentially never do the interests of the poor in America did they ever be even brought up in Congress. And there's a lot of technical literature on this, and there's a lot of books written about this and a lot of reports on this. People know this. So to insinuate that is a democratic system, as opposed to a system that gives economic liberties to people and gives economic opportunity and economic equality, there's a different level of freedom there. People, I think really what it is along that theory, talking about economics here and markets and constitutional guarantees to private property. I think that it just so happens that all of these countries that are, quote, democratic are well immersed and entrenched in the global capitalist system. Therefore, it is very unlikely that the global hegemon will invade them, because they freely give access to their resources to corporate power, whereas Syria does not. And that was an issue in, I believe, 2009, when the Qatari wanted to run a pipeline through Saudi Arabia and then through Syria, and they said no. So, if Syria were to liberalize its economy, they would probably have to say yes. The government would have no say in that. It would be free market.
Yeah, the reason why I think Syria started and it's happened in different stages throughout its history. Hafiz al-Assad tended to represent a more conservative economic approach relative to other factions of the Ba'ath Party represented by his predecessor, Salah Jadid, for example, who he overthrew in the corrective movement in 1970. But yeah, I mean, Syria has adopted market reform, but they haven't been to the extent that the United States would have preferred. And the way you know this is by looking at the investment climate reports that the US State Department puts out about all countries. The last one that I read about Syria, they basically said things like, we don't like Syria's tenancy laws. They're too favorable to the tenants. You know, I can imagine a lot of people here in Australia who are struggling with high rents and just the high cost of living and the price of housing would actually be pleased to hear about any government in the world that has laws that do something to protect the tenants. I'm not painting a rosy picture of Syria. I mean, Syria is not a wealthy country relative to, like, in terms to the Western world, but it is nonetheless a social democracy in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I'm getting breaking reports now that there's 4 casualties reported at the site of the bombing by the United States in Homs. It's unclear what nationality these victims are. As we were mentioning before, this is extremely important in determining the future of this conflict. We mentioned that Hezbollah, Iran, Russia are reported to have ground assets at this base, and I'm assuming if one of their soldiers was a casualty in this bombing, there would be some retaliation on that end. We'll keep you posted on that. So let's return to that general discussion a little bit more. I want to return
Sure.
to this headline here. Andrew, are you still with us? All right, I guess that's a no. Jay, so I want to ask your opinion a little bit about this. What is the the strategic objective here? I mean, how do you think that the neighboring countries, which have traditionally been allied with the United States against Syria, Turkey and Israel, are they? You think that they're going to double down their military efforts now, or is this just a one-off and they're just going to keep their guard up?
I really can't say. I know that a lot of people in Lebanon have been fearing like a Zionist invasion of their country. I know that the US, like one of the interesting shifts in the American approach to Syria prior to these strikes, and I stress prior to these strikes because these strikes seems to have changed things, but there was the United States had given up on regime change, that they simply didn't care anymore about who ruled in Damascus, that their new priority was to start balkanizing Syria by supporting the YPG and supporting Rojava's secessionist attempts so that they can remove themselves from control from Damascus. Now it seems like they've gone back to that original plan, but they're doing the balkanization as well. So really there's 2 strategic objectives with regards to Syria: overthrow the government in Damascus and help to carve out a separate state. If they manage to, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but just with Rojava, I mean, if they manage to like fortify Rojava to the point where the Syrian government feels like it's negotiating with a completely separate state that it has no control over, I mean, that's something that'd be interesting to see, because the Syrian government still has a presence within YPG-held areas. In Hasaka, there's Syrian army bases that are completely surrounded by the YPG. And what was interesting last year is that the United States, no, that's not what happened. The YPG started attacking the Syrian massacre. Then the Syrian government responded by saying, please don't do that. And then they continued to do so. And then eventually the Syrian government responded with an airstrike against the YPG base. And I think the purpose of that act of aggression against those Syrian bases in Hasaka was because the YPG thought that this was the time, because they no longer needed the Syrian government there to protect them. American protection after all. And there was a time before the Americans intervened that the only protection that the YPG in Hasaka had was coming from the Syrian army. The Syrian army had a string of bases around Qarmishli, which was their previously their de facto capital, right? And the Syrian government did that for the simple reason that the YPG were guarding the border with Turkey and preventing the influx of weapons to the mercenaries fighting against the government in Damascus. So I think we need to look at this conflict in terms of the different strategic objectives that the United States has, and in some situations we'll see sounds like it's favorable to the Syrian government, but really the purpose of that rhetoric is in order to further the Balkanization of Syria. And then you'll hear other rhetoric which sounds like it's favorable to the so-called YPG, right? Oh, well, rather I should say you'll hear rhetoric that's anti-ISIS, right? But the only anti-ISIS is in order to protect the YPG.
Well, there's definitely a lot of moving parts here as well. And as I mentioned with I should say the American ally and, fighting against Syria in many respects, Turkey, a doubling down of support for the YPG, and especially supporting them in Manbij to lead the Balkanization effort would definitely upset the Turks, who are staunch. They actually criticized the Obama administration, saying, this may affect our diplomatic relations, our entry into NATO. This will affect a lot of things going forward if you continue to support what they call terrorists in their country. And this would also heavily upset the Iranians because, as we know, the Kurds have ambitions to set up Kurdistan in large swaths of Iran. So it definitely seems that this is further complicating, that aspect of the conflict. And it seems that the United States continues this wishy-washy policy, sometimes favoring Balkanization, sometimes supporting direct regime change, sometimes actually caring about national security, which at all times seems to be completely on the back burner. And this has even been acknowledged by people in the Joint Chiefs. Seymour Hersh actually released an article in the London Review of Books called Military to Military, in which many people in the U.S. military were actually very critical of Turkey's role, not only in supporting ISIS, but not in being a good faith ally to the United States interests in Syria. And many people were recommending that we, do not allow them entry into NATO anymore, that we, continue NATO policy without Turkey and isolate them.
I think with regards to Turkey, the major contradiction between the states is that Turkey doesn't like the alliance between the United States and the YPG. That being said, I don't think we should overstate the antagonism that Turkey has towards the YPG. They might also see this as one potential way of exporting the problem of a potential Kurdistan from Anatolia into Syria, right? That's also on the table. It basically just takes like a change in the head of state of Turkey for that to happen. If they might be more practical about this. Who knows, right? Governments in Turkey change. I'm just speculating at this stage, right? I'm not basing this on anything. But I think it's important to begin with an understanding that there is a contradiction between the Turks and the United States about what to do with the Kurds, with the Kurdish question in general.
And how about the Israeli question? As you know, the Israelis would definitely benefit from a crippling of the Syrian Air Force, as they've made promiscuous use of illegally bombing Syrian positions, as well as Hezbollah positions within Syria, when the Syrian Air Force is not able to respond. So it seems that a crippling of the Air Force of Syria bombing air bases would definitely open the door for more Israeli airstrikes.
Yeah, it would. What's interesting about Israel's, relationship to the so-called rebels is that it's something that's rarely ever talked about. Any discussion about like Israel and Syria, or Israel's relationship to the Syrian conflict, has to begin with the fact that Israel has repeatedly bombed Syrian government positions on behalf of the Syrian state. It has to acknowledge that Israel has treated Jabhat al-Nusra and Free Syrian Army fighters in their hospitals. That's something that's never mentioned. And yes, Israel has been caught red-handed, supplying even weapons. We have, not red-handed, sorry, I take that back. Israeli weapons have been found, right, to have been in the possession of rebels after they've been captured, right? All of these things represent Israel's general strategy towards Syria, which is that they're trying to bleed the country. Interestingly, when the conflict started, in the first year of the conflict, there was a period in which the Syrian government was releasing political prisoners, and one of them, his name was Kamal Abwani. The reason he was sent to prison in Syria in the first place is charged with encouraging foreign states to attack Syria, which is exactly what he proceeded to do after being released from prison. He's the one that's been photographed with a picture of the FSA flag next to the Israeli flag. He was actually a member of the Syrian National Coalition. He left, I think, in 2011 or 2012 or something like that. But he was a part of that general setup. And so I think Israel is also looking at trying to find people among the so-called Syrian opposition, but it's also very difficult for Israel to do that because it is generally an embarrassing thing for Arabs to associate themselves with this entity that a lot of them have been socialized to believe, quite correctly, in my opinion, is completely illegitimate in the first place.
Just getting a report in right now. Just reading this from Sputnik. Sputnik reported that the U.S. had no contact with Moscow prior or after U.S. attacked the airfield in Homs. The Americans apparently reported that this was not the case, that they did warn the Russians. Now, how do you feel about this? I mean, I definitely think that this is an important key moment here, right, between the two major powers that are at play here in Syria, whether or not they are actively communicating, especially in dangerous situations that could involve their troops.
Yeah, I mean, I was having a conversation about this the other day, and I was of the opinion, this is before these recent strikes, I was of the opinion that the United States was going to be very cautious about this simply because you have two nuclear powers confronting each other. But then now we have this latest situation which just demonstrates the aggressiveness and recklessness of the United States. I mean, I've had some people say to me in the past, Russia made a very big mistake by not making Turkey pay for shooting down its jet, because it may be suggested that Russia was being a little bit soft. But then I thought that the Russian position was vindicated later when Turks decided to apologize to, right? And at a certain point in time, it looked like there was like a growing kind of rapprochement, like tendencies towards non-aggression between Turkey and Russia that were not as cold, but now, I think that Turkey's way back in the net, right? So, you know, they're still keen on overthrowing the government, and they are going to use it as a stand or as a launching pad for continuing this aggression.
It appears, though, with this this discrepancy between the U.S. being able to communicate with people on the ground, that if the United States were willing to at least talk to the Russians, at least talk to the Syrians, the chemical attack, which, you know, as I mentioned, I believe in Al Masdar reported, was result of a Syrian airstrike that hit a weapons depot in Khan Shaykhun that just so happened to have chemical weapons in it. If the United States were actually talking to the Syrian Air Force or the Russian Air Force, they would be able to corroborate the story and find out the facts. And the fact that they're, you know, not even willing to reach out and, you know, get an air traffic report or something like that, which could easily alleviate this situation. You know, they could know
Mhm.
exactly where the strike came from, where the jet came from that did the strike. The fact that they're not even willing to do that shows just this complete unwillingness to listen, and the willingness to take so-called activists, and rebel leaders, opposition leaders, the Syrian Civil Defense Force at their word. And this is especially more the case with the American media, who are willing or unwilling to corroborate their stories, and they don't even have journalists on the ground, especially not in Idlib. I mean, many journalists understand if they
Mhm.
went to Idlib, they would be kidnapped.
Yeah, that's the other part of this story that's never talked about, which is that a lot of people are taking for granted and taking at face value what's being told to them by groups and organizations and shady bodies that are operating in Idlib, like for example the White Helmets, and they should remember that journalists would not find it easy to get into Idlib. I mean, it's a very dangerous place. The FSA has a history of trying to get journalists killed, to blame it on the Syrian government. That's what Alex Thompson said. He reported for Channel 4 News. He said the FSA tried to get me killed, right? And so they're trusting the very people that they can't trust with their own lives, right? And that's something that's not talked about. All the evidence that we have comes from those people that journalists cannot trust with their own lives, right?
And they're willing to trust the truth and what will eventually lead to the future of Syria with these people. It's definitely
Yeah,
a
yeah. But actually,
large source
I
of
also wanted to
hypocrisy
say
for these people. Yes.
it's also like I think maybe a definite part of their policy to terrify Western journalists from entering places like Idlib, because that way they're the ones who control the script. They're the ones who control the video footage and the evidence that gets out there and the fabrications.
Absolutely. We're just getting this report in right now. Lath actually wrote an article saying that ISIL launched an offensive near the U.S. military, or sorry, the Syrian military base that the U.S. launched missiles at. This is almost reminiscent, almost actually entirely the same situation as when the United States on September 17th, 2016, launched that strike on Deir ez-Zor province against the Syrian Arab army with the white phosphorus. And then ISIS was able to advance on the position there as a result of the Air Force, which actually spawned the emergency UNSC meeting that the Russians had spearheaded.
Right. So you're saying that. So what happened with ISIS again? So what did they?
Yeah. So just
What happened?
recently, actually, in the past couple minutes, Al-Masdar just reported that ISIL launched an offensive on the air base that was bombed by the United States.
Oh, just recently. So just the recent one in Homs.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Gonna have to have a look at that.
I mean, is that any surprise to you? I mean, again, as I mentioned in Deir ez-Zor, it has happened, and many people have accused the United States of it as essentially acting in many cases as the de facto air force for ISIS in some of these isolated cases. And perhaps, again, that has to do, I mean, I'm not one to buy into believing that the United States is actively working with ISIS in any substantial way. But perhaps, again, as I mentioned before, with the lack of communication, this is another symptom of the arrogance of launching military efforts into a country without their consent and without their, without information being given to them and reciprocated.
I think it's probably a good time to check out the maps online to see if there's any updates there. If you go to Syria.ua map, then there's a lot of updates there that I want to look at actually. So, have you read the reports that come from Hama, from Shayra?
No, I have not actually had a chance to look at those. I've been
Oh, that's
stuck on,
fine. I mean, I'm just informing you about them, but yeah, it's like so far, for example, aside from that, they mention just an idea of what the intentions could possibly be. Okay. It says Army Brigadier General Sharaf Khalil Ibrahim killed in US Tomahawk missile attack. So we have some names that are flowing through of the people. Um, okay, apparently the military airbase had several Sukhoi jets and several other jets that were destroyed. So there's been, again, like, significant attempt to downgrade or undermine Syria's aerial capabilities. So what else have you been seeing?
As far as this offensive just launched in Homs, there are no reported casualties at this point, but the offensive has been launched, and because of the weakened air positions there in Homs, it's foreseeable that the situation could get worse. Obviously, with the air base being bombed, we are just, I mean, this is a developing story. We are watching this, but I was just making quick comments, about the context of this and how at times the United States has, not been willing to communicate with the Syrians and inadvertently helped ISIS advance, which, is a direct threat to both countries.
Yeah.
And again, I think here we see, the Trump administration has taken this hard line against ISIS. I mean, many in America, I think, are very wed to the idea, and I think quite rightly, that ISIS is one of the greatest threats to peace right now, right? And playing on that popular opinion, I mean, I don't think that there's anybody really in the United States that has a support for ISIS, right? And so clearly that was a part of his campaign, but here he is now, without even realizing it, helping their military cause in Syria. I mean, I think that's really interesting to note. Again, I think that if they were cooperating more with the Syrians and the Russians, this would be less of a problem, especially as it was in Deir ez-Zor. And I think that was probably more of an anomalous case. I don't think that the Obama administration was necessarily behind that. There was actually a former Democratic congressman who made a comment on that, believing that it was more or less the deep state trying to destroy the peace talks that was going on at the time between Russia and the United States. And I'd like to
Are you talking about the Deir ez-Zor attack?
Yes.
Talking about the Deir ez-Zor. Oh, right. Okay. So you're saying
so
that
I'd like to elaborate on that. I mean, do you think that this latest chemical attack, I mean, if we frame it in this way, and I've heard people talk about it like this, that last week, so I don't even know if it was last week, but recently, the administration had said that Assad would, not be the main target of military efforts in Syria. They would double down on fighting jihadists, right? So it appeared at that point that there could be a potential for peace. And then now, very shortly afterwards, here we are in the midst of this. And as this Democratic congressman said on Fox News, saying that he didn't believe it was the administration that was behind this, but he believed that it was the deep state, or at least the intelligence community coupled with the military industrial complex, destroying a peace settlement, that he believed that this was their doing to perpetuate the war. And perhaps, as you were mentioning before we went on, that the potential that the chemical weapons attack might have been at least known about prior to this, that could also be a potential theory behind it.
Has Trump made any statements yet to these airstrikes?
Yeah, he actually mentioned that that there was more or less a surgical strike to attack the position that they believe the chemical airstrike had originated from.
Okay. Yeah, it's all kind of to me, right?
Which demonstrates to me at least
about the facts.
It demonstrates to me at least that he not only is keenly aware of it, but that perhaps he may have been more involved in this, and perhaps he may, actually, this is an interesting point. Many of his supporters on the alt-right, people that hang out in Poland and things like that, I've seen at least some of their conversation on social media, and these people from Poland and so on are just like saying things like, I just can't believe that Donald Trump gave in so easily into what is a very obvious false flag incident, and they're baffled that he was willing to do that.
That's
Give
because
in to
they're
that. I
naive,
mean,
to be honest.
I have to say that I agree.
Yeah, I should have like a proper doubt to what extent does the United States oppose ISIS? And this is a very great question because it's something that people don't fully get. When the United States launched their intervention into Syria, ISIS, in that 1 year period, right, the first year in which the United States was there, and that is, so from when the United States started to just the eve of the Russian intervention a year later, in that period of time, Islamic State actually territory. It didn't shrink, it actually got stronger. The United States intervened. The justice that they gave was because they felt that Iraqi Kurdistan was under it. And you can't defend Kurdistan unless you defend Mosul as well. So as the United States has been towards the Iraqi government as well, which is another thing that's not true, because people tend to just assume that the Iraqi ally of the United States, but the United States has a long history of destabilizing them as they see them as Iran. You can't actually defend Iraqi Kurdistan unless you defend the rest of Iraq as well. And so the United States was forced to intervene for that reason. In Syria, they were forced to intervene because they want to help, like Rojava state try and carve out its own secessionist republic, right? So that's the extent to which the United States is against a state. They are perfectly happy with Islamic State launching offensives into Syrian held territory. I don't think Trump is naive, stupid. I think he understands foreign policy. I think he understands how Islamic State emerged, its founders, and all the rest of it. I think fundamentally he's trying to bolster Syria. It's for the purposes of balkanizing Syria that Islam is demonized.
Absolutely. So you believe, though, you believe that he has this strong understanding of foreign policy?
Yes, I absolutely do. I cannot accept the idea that the state of US imperialism, who has so many advisors under him, who is, as it seems, a very hard-working candidate, and like the guy, he seems to have put a lot into this, and he seems to have gotten a lot of people on side, and he does talk as an American nationalist who wants to rebuild America's defenses. He does talk about the need for greater against China, but he has, of course, played the diplomatic game towards Russia, at least in the lead up to the elections, right? I mean, now the rhetoric, I think, right, the idea that he's just naive or stupid or he's played by the deep state, and I just don't buy it. I think there's a long history of this. I mean, people forget Obama came to power in 2008. A lot of people thought that he was a peacenik, and the liberals, as you call them in the United States, liberals in the United States are basically suggesting, for a long time, suggested that Trump, Putin, or something like that. But they used to say exactly the same thing about they used to compare him to Stalin. They used to compare him just like associate him with the Soviet and with Mao's China and things like that. This whole thing of the challenging candidate, right, from the opposition party represents the interest of foreign, seems to be something that recurs in American history. You know, like even in the past, you know, liberal leaders have been called Soviet Union, right? Like during the days of the Cold War. So none of this is new, right? I think the only thing that's changed is the strategy of the United States, but only slightly, right? Actually, it's not even a change in that sense. Now they're realizing the balkanization agenda, but now they've basically gone back to the regime change agenda. And Trump's that. It's just that he used the rhetoric of the balkanization agenda to make people believe that he was against regime change in Syria when he's in favor of both.
All right, Jay Thurupple, thank you for being on our show. This is our actually first installation of many that's to come at Alma Star Live here. And we'll be back
Thank
soon.
you so much for having me on. Thanks for having me on. I was before for not happening because I was just a little bit confused, but thank you so much.